Good afternoon and welcome to everyone who's joining us for the Education Preparation and Licensure Subcommittee meeting of the State Board of Education. Members joining us are Mr. Bob Eby and Mr. Mike Edwards and myself, Lillian Hartgrove. We're going to kick off our agenda with some opening remarks from our Executive Director, Dr. Sarah Morrison. Dr. Morrison?
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Great to see everyone. Wish, of course, that we were in person, but happy to be working with you all today on our WebEx platform. And like always, when this subcommittee comes together, it's a pretty stacked agenda. I'm looking forward to the conversation. We've got a number of different brief updates on things like our educator prep report card that our state board team has been working on and want to get input from this group about several decisions ahead of us. We'll be hearing from our partners at the department about some of the ways that our ed prep partners are working assiduously to adjust and adapt, particularly this fall semester, in ways that they've needed to in terms of the COVID-19 crisis, and some additional updates as well on things related to board policy changes around licensure. And so I know we've got a full agenda. Look forward to everyone engaging. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Madam Chair. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. Well, because we do have a very tight agenda, we'll go ahead and jump right in. I am looking forward to a lively discussion, as always. Very important discussion items before us today. So let's go ahead and move into the first agenda presentation. And a reminder, too, once again, please mute your phone if you're not speaking, and please state your name and title for the record. First up is Ms. Erica Light. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Erica Light, Senior Research Associate for the State Board of Education. And today I'll be talking a bit about the 2020 Educator Preparation Report Card and options that we have for the report card, considering the data limitations caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So as a reminder, this is the most recent scoring framework that we used for the report card. The 2019 report card was released on February 14th, 2020, and it had the scoring framework that you see on this slide here with 3 different scored domains. So the candidate profile domain is about EPPs recruiting racially and ethnically diverse candidates, as well as candidates who earn high demand endorsements, such as special education, English as a second language, secondary math and science, etc. Then the employment domain is a measure of how long teachers are staying in the classroom once they have finished their preparation program. We're not able to look super far into the future with this, since we only look at people who graduated up to 3 years ago, but we can look to see if they're still in the classroom after 2 years and if they're still in the classroom after 3 years. Then the domain we're most interested in talking about today is the provider impact domain, which, as you can see, has the largest number of points. And that is the domain which specifically examines teachers' evaluations after they have entered the classroom. So we have points both for observation scores and for student growth, or TBOS scores. And just as a reminder, when we look at TBOS scores on the report card, we only use individual TBOS scores. So teachers in untested grades and subjects who would receive a school-wide TBOS score, those are not included in the report card. Those teachers would have their observation scores included in the report card, but not TBOS. We also have, at this point, 25 reserved points on the report card for possible future use. We have reserved 10 points for candidate satisfaction, which is measured by the Tennessee Educator Survey, and 15 points for licensure assessments, which includes pass rates on EdTPA and subject area assessments that are required for licensure. So this is a screenshot of what a provider report looks like on the 2019 report card. This is just an example of Austin P. So you can see that their overall performance rating was that they met expectations. On this most recent report card, each EPP received a performance rating of exceeds expectations, meets expectations, or does not meet expectations based on the percentage of possible points that they earned in the 3 scored domains that we saw on the previous slide. In addition to the overall score, the EPPs received sub-scores or sub-ratings for each of the 3 scored domains. So this, again, is an example from Austin P. So you can see that on the candidate profile domain, they received a rating of meets expectations. They exceeded expectations for employment, and they met expectations for provider impact. And then in the second row there, we have the 2 unscored domains of candidate assessment and satisfaction, which may potentially be scored in the future, but on this most recent report card were not scored. So our dilemma that we're facing this year is that we have no teacher evaluation data from the 2019-20 school year. So this chart here is a visualization of what evaluation data we do have that we can include in the report card. So the 3 cohorts that we will have in this next upcoming report card are the 2016-17 cohort, the 2017-18 cohort, and the newest cohort, the 2018-19 cohort. So that refers to the academic year in which the candidate graduated, or if they're a job-embedded candidate, the year in which they enrolled in their job-embedded program. So we have the boxes on this slide here show the data that we have previously reported for the 2 older cohorts, which we will be reporting again. And then we have a small amount of new data from the 2018-19 cohort from candidates who were job-embedded candidates who were teaching in 2018-19. They would have received evaluations, and if they were in a tested grade and subject, they would have received an individual TVOS score in 2018-19, and we will be able to include those in the report card. But as you can see from the bottom row, we have no new data from the 2019-20 school year. Earlier this month, we convened our report card advisory council for the first time this year. This council consists of a variety of stakeholders. Vice Chairman Bob Eby of the State Board of Education is a member of this council. We also have Chairman John Reagan from the Tennessee General Assembly. He was not able to join us for our first meeting this year, but we hope to have him with us at future meetings. And then in addition, we have representatives from several EPPs. They're located in various areas of the state, and we have representatives from public, private, and alternative EPPs in order to get a variety of different perspectives there. And we also had a couple of representatives from districts and a couple of other partners such as SCORE and TERA. The council met virtually on September 15th, and we discussed possible options for the provider impact domain, given the lack of evaluation data from 2019. So the 3 options that we have basically narrowed down to for the provider impact domain are shown here on this slide. These first 2 were ones that State Board staff had come up with before the advisory council meeting, and we discussed with the advisory council. And then this third option is one that actually was suggested during the advisory council meeting. So for option 1, we would take the data that we have available and give EPPs a provider impact rating using that data. And then, as we have in previous years, we would take the provider impact rating along with their ratings in the other 2 scored domains and combine those into an overall rating. The main thing we would need to change here is we would have to adjust the performance benchmarks to account for the fact that we would only have 2 years of data, and that these 2 years of data would include a smaller number of third-year teachers than we would normally have. Option 2 would be to report the data that we have available, which we are in fact required by statute to report, but not provide a rating. So you would be able to see what percentage of an EPP's completers earned a level 3 or above on their observation, or level 3 or above on their TVOS, et cetera, for the individuals for which we have data available. But there would be no overall rating given either for the provider impact domain or for the report card overall. we have a policy in place, which we've had as long as we've made this report card, that if you do not have a rating in all 3 domains, that you do not receive an overall rating. So in this case, the EPPs would receive ratings for the other 2 domains of candidate profile and employment, but would not receive the overall rating. Finally, we have option 3, in which the EPPs would receive a rating for provider impact and for the other 2 score domains as well, but would not receive an overall rating. This was recommended by some of our EPP stakeholders during the advisory council meeting as a possible middle ground between options 1 and 2. Like option 1, it would also require us to make some adjustments to benchmarks to account for fewer third-year teachers in the data set, but then we would not be giving an overall rating as we had in previous years. So at this point, I'm going to pause and answer any questions you have about these options, and I'm also interested to hear your thoughts about these options.
Erica, I have a question. Did the actual council give a recommendation of the 3? Did you all discuss them sufficiently to get a sense of, or if you actually made a determination which one they would recommend?
We did not come to a final recommendation at this point. We are convening again on October 28th. And so what we had planned to do was take the discussion that took place during this meeting into account in the October 28th meeting. And at that point, they may come up with a final recommendation. But at this point, they saw pros and cons for all 3 of these options.
Erica, this is Bob. Can I make a couple of comments?
Yes, go ahead.
So, yeah, I mean, I always value the advisory council meeting because you get to hear from the EPPs as well as the stakeholders. You heard several comments. I mean, there were comments like, well, K through 12 ought to get a grace. I mean, EPP should get a grace period like K through 12 is getting a grace period was one comment. But one thing that came up, I'm not sure we got an answer for. Does the Tennessee Code Annotated require a single rating? I know we talked about that or asked that question. Or could you do like option 3? There was a lot of talk about option 3, but then you don't get an overall rating. Does TCA require a single rating or not, an overall rating?
I'll defer to Amy on this one. Yes.
I'll also pull Sarah in. We're going to be doing a fair bit of phone a friend, apparently. Historically, interpreted it that way because we are required to produce a report card, and as you know, on a report card you have summative grades looking across the board. However, as you mentioned before, Bob, this is an extraordinary year, an extraordinary time period. So, Sarah, what would you want to add there?
Well, again, yeah, I think we've interpreted it different ways over the years, given the data that we had and who was producing it. I don't think the statute is specific in terms of requiring an overall score. I think that is sort of insinuated or intended. But I think it's probably one of those things that if the General Assembly were to take up legislation on accountability writ large for K-12, we'd want to include this just to sort of safeguard ourselves. But I think it would be an option to provide scores at the domain level, but not an overall rating. I don't think we would technically be outside. This is a question for Angie Sanders, our General Counsel, for sure, but I don't think we would be outside of our legal requirement in doing so.
Thank you. I think the other concern is that there's so little new data this year compared to what's been there in the past, because you don't have anything from the 2019-2020 year, and you dropped off the earlier year, the first year. And so the only new data that you have is those job embedded for the 2018-2019 or something like that. And I think that was one of the concerns that the EPP brought up, is that, you know, what you're putting an overall rating just basically on a partial year's worth of data. So it was a concern.
Well, the rating would also be based on those 2 earlier cohorts, which have more complete data. And those cohorts were reported before So there would be some continuity from what they had previously as their rating. They would not necessarily receive the exact same rating because, as you mentioned, the oldest cohort is dropping off, but there would still be, they would not be receiving a rating solely on the basis of just those 2018-19 job embedded candidates.
One thing we also discussed with the advisory council, Erica talked about the impact of adjusting performance benchmarks for third-year teachers. Historically, our third-year teachers are those who have some of the highest observation and TVOS scores, which makes sense. People tend to improve the longer they spend in the profession. So as that oldest cohort rolls off and we don't have new data from the folks who were in their third year in 1920, it may look like there are lower observation and TVOS scores broadly across EPPs. And so that's one thing we want to be conscious of, that we are setting a reasonable standard, knowing it would only be first and second year teachers in that group for this year. And also that we want to be really careful that we're not somehow conveying a message that things are getting worse over time. This would be an anomaly of the data, and not having data for 1920, not that people are somehow going backward.
I think that's an important distinction to be making, Amy. So thank you for that. With that being said, I am certainly interested to know if Mr. Edwards has anything that he wants to add, because in reviewing, and just let me say this, in reviewing the options before the conversation, I was leaning heavily toward option 2 as my recommendation. I'm not saying I've changed my mind on that. That's just where I am right now at this point in time. Nothing has been said that changes my mind, but through further discussion, I certainly could give the right to alter my recommendation. So with that being said, Mr. Edwards, do you have any thoughts you want to convey? I promise you I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I definitely want to hear any thoughts you may have on these 3 options.
Yeah, I was, right before you asked that question, I asked myself, I got to think about this a while. I'm sorry. My gut is to change it the least that we can, but I can see the value to some on that. So I don't know that I have a recommendation yet.
And I understand that, the thing that I'm thinking about, and a comment that came out of the advisory group, and Mr. Eby shared that with us, that is not negatively impacting EPPs for something that was out of their control, but by including information that is relevant and as current as possible to ensure that anyone looking at the report understands how this EPP is performing in these particular domains. And Mr. Eby, Bob, question for you. Do you have one that stands out as the preferred option among the 3?
Well, I think I sort of tend to agree with you on option 2, just because it was such an unusual year. And I'm afraid that if you use less data, and the data that you've thrown out is the one that's more likely to have the higher TVOS scores, then you will indirectly penalize EPPs, and I don't think we want to do that. And so I guess I would lean more toward option 2 also.
One question, Erica, as we're discussing this, can you talk to us a little bit about the impact of adjusting those performance benchmarks? You went through that, but I think, again, this is sort of weedy, and it takes a little time to kind of understand the impact of some of the things you've suggested, but because that's sort of the difference between 2 and 3 is that we would be accounting for the loss, or the potentially fewer third-year teachers in that evaluation data versus 2, where we would kind of leave it more as is, like the pros and cons in doing that as well as what it actually means to do that.
All right. Well, I apologize for background noise. There's mowing going on outside my house right now. But for option 2, we would not need to adjust benchmarks because we wouldn't be giving a rating, but we would still need to explain somewhere prominently on the report card that the mixture of candidates included is not the same mixture in terms of experience level that we've had in previous years, because otherwise, and this was something that came up during the advisory council, if we don't send a clear message or tell a clear story, other people will fill in their own story. And we don't want people to be filling in a story that's inaccurate about EPPs getting worse when in fact it's just a case of the teachers we're reporting this year are on average less experienced. So we would need to have clear messaging regardless of which of these options we choose. But if we do choose one of the options that involves adjusting the benchmarks, what we've done to set the benchmarks initially was look at previous years of data and find the 10th and 90th percentiles of performance on metrics. The reason we used previous years of data and not current data is because we don't want EPPs to be competing against each other. So if we had used current year data, they would kind of indirectly be competing against each other, which we do not want. But we would have to go back and recalculate those 10th and 90th percentiles using data that excludes the third year of teachers or the teachers who are in their third year of teaching, just so that we can get an idea of what performance has been in the past for first and second year teachers specifically.
One thing I think that's really important to recognize is that lost year data is going to stay with us for 3 years. And so I think we're going to have to explain it all the way through. So that was a point that was brought up that, a lot of people say, well, you just lost this year. We can just handle it for this year. But that missing data is going to, if you look at that chart, it's going to be with us for 3 years, basically.
And that's a great point, Bob. I do just want to reiterate, and I know you know this very well, I'm just reiterating for everybody, the reason we use 3 years of data is to ensure that we have more stability in our outcomes and reporting on EPPs. As you all know, if we use just the most recent year of data, there's more volatility. There's more likely to be something that occurred with one group of students and not another that might be throwing off scores in a direction that's not necessarily representative of the EPP over time. So we've gone back and forth about this before. We could use 1 year of data. We could use 5 years of data if we wanted to have a lot more data to use. But we landed on 3 years because after 3 years, it's less clear the link between what somebody learned in their EPP and what they're doing in the classroom, because by then they've been to a number of district trainings, they may have gotten further education, et cetera.
Yeah, my only point is to recognize that whether we use 3 years or whatever, is that is going to, the amount of data that we have for the next 3 years is going to be less than what we typically use. And so the volatility is going to be greater no matter what we end up doing. We just need to have a good explanation in what we do and why we do and for the results.
I think that really speaks to, we need to pay real close attention to our footnotes, and with the idea that anybody picks this document up from anywhere for whatever purpose, they can read it and understand where the numbers came from and why, and so that they can, it's not, they don't recorrelate it to a previous report card. Probably special attention to those footnotes.
Very good guidance, and we'll make sure as we work with the website design folks that we can prominently display that text and that piece of information.
Amy and Erica, in terms of getting to a decision, we have another advisory council meeting scheduled for the end of October, correct?
Correct.
And we've asked our advisory council to sleep on this, to get additional input from their stakeholders and come back ready to discuss and help advise us on a decision at that time, right?
Yes. And if y'all are comfortable with it, I would love to make the same charge of our subcommittee members today of sleep on this, think about it, and that next advisory council is October 28th. If you would like to individually email Erica with your thoughts and input before then, she'll be able to share it with our staff Because I know the Advisory Council is also interested in making sure that what they think through and what they propose would meet the board's expectations.
Exactly. We'll do that.
That would be very helpful. Thank you.
And Erica, why don't you plan to reach out to our subcommittee members too? If you haven't heard, just we'll kind of put this back to the top of your brains here in a few weeks and sort of see where your thoughts are at that point.
So,
yes, I can do that.
When in getting our thoughts and ideas, to the extent they're passed along, I think we need to be real careful that we're not indicating what our vote would be as a board member in a board meeting. And nor that anything that we might recommend is necessarily going to pass the board. It does require a board vote.
Typically, the report card decisions have not required a board vote. Sarah, you can correct me if I'm wrong. In general, we have a subcommittee meeting in December where we review what the Advisory Council recommended and then what staff recommend based on that. And then through the subcommittee's feedback, we're able to proceed with staff plans.
Yeah, and that's because there are just so many detailed decisions each year that get made. It would be complicated to bring that to a board vote. But I think your input is very important, and it is sort of a collective wisdom in terms of listening to both the subcommittee today and also our advisory council and try and get things between you.
Yeah.
I misthought.
No problem. But we will reconvene the subcommittee several months prior to the report card launch to make sure that we're clear on the direction coming out of this group.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I do have one additional slide here, which is just about the other topic we're going to be discussing with the Advisory Council this fall. Some of these we've already begun to discuss, but we've not come to any conclusive decisions yet. So we will be at our October 28th meeting, in addition to revisiting this issue about provider impact, we will be discussing whether and how to score the new candidate assessment and satisfaction domains. It's possible if we start scoring those that they will be another source of data that will allow EPPs to have another way that they can show how well they're doing in addition to what we already have, which could help to, well, it's not a replacement for the teacher evaluation data. It is useful as just another data point that gives a more holistic picture of what's going on. And we have also discussed, we've begun discussing how to present data about occupational teachers on the report card. This is a very important group of teachers, but they have somewhat different requirements for their admission into programs, and they're teaching specific CCTE courses. And we want to make sure that we are also holding EPPs to high standards for their occupational teachers, but we recognize too that they are a different group of candidates than the more academic teachers. We are going to consider addition of possible new unscored metrics, which would be, one example might be what percentage of each EPP's candidates are placed in urban, suburban, or rural districts was one suggestion that I've heard. And that would be a relatively easy thing for us to add, would be for informational purposes only, and might give people who are investigating different EPPs an idea of the type of environments that these EPPs completers go on to teach in. And finally, we are considering possible adjustments to the list of high needs endorsements. This list has not been updated since 2016, which is when the state board began producing the report card. We don't expect that the high needs areas have changed drastically, but we think it may be time to revisit those.
Very good.
Or comments on the report card for the upcoming year. And as we've said, this is not your final chance to weigh in on it, but this is after our first advisory council meeting.
After me. Ready to go on? Erica, great job. You make it easy for us as much as possible. Thank you so much for that. Amy, we're ready for the next presentation. That's Dr. Annie Insana. Correct?
Great, thank you. That's correct. Good afternoon, Annie Insana, Tennessee Department of Education. I'm the Senior Director of Educator Prep. Today we'll be talking through the COVID-19 flexibility and how it has impacted our EPPs and the plans that we've supported our EPPs to generate and implement. So after the passing of the language in July related to the educator preparation policy, which gave flexibility to EPPs to modify clinical experiences and assessments, our office created a template that was provided to deans and directors on August 2nd. They had approximately a month or so to complete this template. And all 40 of our approved EPPs did submit a plan. And these plans were focused specifically on the changes and the modifications for the fall 2020 semester only. The requirements within this plan that we asked EPPs to submit included three bigger buckets. The first was any changes or modifications that EPPs are making to the instructional plans related to the duration and the delivery of curriculum and assessments. Second was any changes or modifications to candidates' clinical experiences, which would include both the early field experiences as well as clinical practice. And then finally, we asked them to address any issues of equity, which may include issues related to technology and internet needs for candidates, health issues, or any other extenuating circumstances. The next slide shows a summary of results across all 40 of our providers. Nearly all of our EPPs have altered their semester schedule somewhat. Most EPPs will forego their fall break and will end around November 20th, and many of the candidates will actually complete their finals online the week after Thanksgiving. We also saw that most EPPs will be engaging candidates in virtual early field experiences, so they made a pretty easy switch. Again, before student teaching or their internship, for example, they were able to engage candidates in virtual experiences using videos or online tutoring, for example. Most EPPs indicated there weren't any big changes to curriculum, with the exception of shifting the delivery of courses, say, to online and making any sort of changes depending on the impact of COVID within their particular location. EPPs are working with partner districts to provide candidate mentoring and supervising either face-to-face or virtually. What we saw is that many of them stayed with the mechanisms that they're using to either mentor or supervise their candidates. So, for example, if they're using the team rubric, they continue to use the team rubric. They're just pivoting to use it electronically and engage with their candidates virtually. Finally, what we've seen as a trend or a pattern across responses of these plans is that EPPs are ensuring access to technology, internet hotspots, and different types of virtual platforms. They are often following their university COVID-19 plans and providing support for candidates in need, and really evaluating on a case-by-case basis with their candidates any sort of extenuating circumstances that are impeding any sort of clinical experiences or performance in their courses. Finally, what we wanted to provide for you here were certain examples that we saw from these plans that really highlight the adaptability of our EPPs during this very trying time. Some of these examples include ETSU had installed hotspots in their parking lot so that students didn't have to enter the building for virtual instruction or support, but they still had access to the internet. Teach for America Memphis will be adding curriculum to their existing curriculum that's more focused around development for teaching within a virtual setting, agility, and problem solving amidst uncertainty. UTK is using the money that they would have spent on the end of the year celebration and instead now providing stipends for practice exams. National Teacher Residency and Tusculum University are creating student emergency funds for student technology needs. So for those who are finding themselves in these extenuating circumstances and still have those needs, they're able to provide for them. And then also what we're seeing is most EPPs are providing professional development for teaching in a virtual setting and using various learning management systems or online platforms for both faculty and candidates. So if they had previously been doing only face-to-face learning and very quickly had to pivot and say, use Canvas, for example. And a lot of candidates and faculty may have been unfamiliar. These EPPs are providing that professional development for them so they can attain and access that. So finally, what we're thinking through now is, again, thinking about fall 2020 is all we ask them to consider given the ever-changing situation with COVID. And so our plans for spring semester, knowing that we'll probably be in very similar situations, is to resubmit the plans back to the EPPs that they provided for the fall and ask them to examine what their plans are for the spring in the same areas, curriculum, clinical experiences, any extenuating circumstances to ensure equity, and then ask them to make those changes in late fall, provide that evidence back to our office, which will examine and be able to sort of navigate and update our records and continue to support our EPPs in that regard. So with that, I'll turn it over for any questions or comments.
Process, and I believe TACTI will probably take this on, but I think about when you see examples of adaptability, how might this data and these different examples being shared with other EPPs, especially when there's some more data that comes from them as how successful they are with some of these examples that they're actually implementing. I'm just curious to know if there will be an opportunity for them to share, and I would imagine that it would be through TACTI. So I don't know if you have any other information to share on that. I'm particularly interested in all of them, but the last bullet, it says most EPPs, and if we'll have that data that will let us know who is not providing that opportunity. I'm just more curious because we certainly have heard with teachers that are in the field today with the struggles that they have experienced in not having prior experience in teaching in a virtual world. And yes, they've had opportunities for professional development. We just don't know if that's been sufficient to get them where they need to be. So I'm particularly interested in preparing those that are in the pipeline now, since it's likely to be our reality sometime into the future.
Mm-hmm. Sure. To your latter point, I think we can do a deeper dive into that last bullet and really examine who is doing this well, and maybe if there are any holes, what do they need? How can we continue to network with other EPPs that are doing it well? I know that the CAPE standards are changing, and we, of course, adopt the CAPE standards to evaluate all of our provider levels. And the CAPE standards are very thoughtful about integrating more of an intention on virtual learning within their standards. So in the long term, I know this is going to be a focus as well. In terms of opportunities to learn and network from each other, you are right that TACTI is occurring next week, in fact, and many of the breakout sessions and conversations that are on the agenda will focus around what EPPs have done to pivot to do virtual ed TPA, or I know there's a session by Maryville College that's talking about some of the choice boards that they've implemented as they've had to pivot from face-to-face to online. One other networking opportunity that I know has been available is through the CEDAR network. And for those that participate in the CEDAR network, which is several of our EPPs, they've been hosting a series of a couple webinars both in August and September, and have been sharing resources and just bringing folks together, kind of talk about the hardships as well as the successes that they've had as they've been able to pivot to mostly virtual learning.
Very good. Thank you.
One comment. I'm really glad to see the curriculum adding virtual teaching in a virtual setting. Obviously, that's very important. Does that include teaching in a hybrid setting? I had the fortune to be with Governor Lee at La Follette Middle School, and we were in a class, and the teacher was teaching the class, but she was also teaching virtually at the same time. She had students at home as well as in the classroom, and that seems to me that would be a whole different ballgame in itself. So are the EPPs working on hybrid settings as well as, simultaneously virtual and in class?
Great question. So it seems like that is occurring in pockets with some EPPs, not widespread that we're seeing in terms of these plans that they've submitted, but that's another area we can do kind of a deep dive and see who's doing that well, what can we learn from those individuals, and how can we help EPPs share that information.
Any other comments? Thank you, Dr. Nsana. Great presentation. Moving on to the next item is Mr. Michael Derline, licensed.
Hi, everyone. Michael Derline, Senior Director of Educator Licensure and Preparation. Just wanted to use this time to talk about an issue that we've had some internal conversations about, and then we brought to our Educator Preparation Working Group last month. Advanced slide, please. Thanks. So the challenge that we're faced with is we do have a number of states that continue to offer a general social studies endorsement. In Tennessee, we have discipline-specific endorsements in history, geography, economics, and so on. In the last year or so, as the state board has kind of increased flexibility for out-of-state candidates coming to Tennessee for licensure, we have seen that has created a challenge for us as folks come to us with those general social studies endorsements because we don't have a matching endorsement. The way we have approached that has been to require that an individual choose one of the endorsements and submit qualifying scores up front to be able to get that endorsement. Well, as you know, now state board policy allows anyone with a license from out of state, initial or professional level, to get a license in Tennessee without taking assessments up front. So that poses a bit of a conflict there. These three options were discussed with state board staff and some folks internally as well, and then we brought them to our Educator Preparation Working Group. And I'll go through each one, but it was pretty clear during our EPWG meeting that there was a preference for option 2. So the first option is to create a general secondary social studies endorsement for out-of-state educators only. I think the kind of obvious negative there is that it would be an endorsement that's only accessible for folks who come from out of state, and that creates an equity issue. Option 2 is to create a general secondary social studies endorsement for out-of-state educators and also allow in-state candidates to obtain the endorsement by completing one of the already approved discipline-specific programs and then taking an assessment that covers general social studies. So what that might look like is for anyone who's going through a history program or econ program, once they complete that program, not only could they qualify for the history or econ endorsement, they could take the required social studies endorsement and obtain a general social studies endorsement as well. Option 3 would be to, as we've done in other areas, phase out existing endorsements and make a more significant shift in this area and move to a general social studies endorsement for all. Obviously, the challenge there is time. That would take some time for our in-state providers. We would have to go through the process to identify appropriate standards, assessments. EPPs in Tennessee would have to consider changes that they would have to make to their program to cover all of the material required. So there are just some logistical and time challenges with that. Ultimately, the EPWG, I would say, reached consensus with option 2. We had very little dissent there, and in our EdPrep community in Tennessee, made up of EPP and district representatives, felt like option 2 was the most appropriate option. So wanted to just give folks a chance, because I think this is the first time we're bringing anything on this topic to you, a chance to just internalize some of this, ask any questions you may have, because we do anticipate in a future meeting we will take a recommendation to the board for changing this.
Lillian, I have a question.
Yes, Bob.
So let me make sure I understand option 2. So option 2, a teacher from out of state who already has a general secondary social studies endorsement from that out of state, to get that endorsement, have they taken some specific assessment to get that endorsement, or is there other ways that they can get the endorsement without taking an assessment?
Good question. We would require, I think our recommendation would be that we would require that they do take whatever assessment the board adopts there. I know there's a praxis exam in that area. I think we could certainly look into other assessments that maybe Pearson offers. But regardless, if the educator came in with a license in a general social studies area, the current rule would allow them to get a license if this endorsement was available in secondary social studies, and then they would have 3 years to take and pass the required assessment.
Okay.
Madam Chair, if I may, I'd love to add a little color commentary. Michael knows where I'm going with this. As one of those out-of-state educators with a social studies license a number of years ago, coming from an ed prep program in North Carolina, where I taught in North Carolina on my social studies license there, had taken the social studies licensure exam, and when I came to Tennessee, I had to pick which part of social studies did I want to get a license in, and I chose, I think, history and psychology, and ended up taking both those praxis exams. But in theory, if I had also wanted to teach economics and geography, I could have been taking 4 or more licensure exams to obtain all of those in Tennessee. And the pathway that Michael's talking about would have let me come in on that social studies license where I had been approved in another state to teach all of those content areas, and either have the assessment, if it was recent enough from the other state coming in, or take it again as needed in Tennessee.
Thank you for that insight, Amy. Mike, do you have anything you want to add at this juncture?
Michael, or Amy for that matter, walk me backwards, because I'm not sure. So if you come in with a general social studies endorsement, does that instruct the employer as to, if you take this assessment, are you loading up on world history, economics, American history, psychology, I don't know what all is in that under social studies. And that would be instructive as to what, to that employer, what this candidate knows about content in a particular area?
I think that's dependent on what the assessment covers. So I think what we'll need to do is look at the various assessments that are available, determine, do they cover every content area that we have courses in Tennessee? If that answers your question.
I guess, but I'm going back to my tirade on math and wondering how algebra one teacher can do calculus necessarily, likely can, but so now we're talking about history and economics, and they're not necessarily the same subject.
Yeah.
What risk do we have of putting someone in a classroom that does not have adequate content knowledge in that subject?
One thing I would add, and I know this was part of our conversation with EPWG as well, though I can imagine there's some folks out there that would be offended by this comment. There is a belief that the social studies disciplines have more overlap than, more obvious overlap than some of the math or science disciplines, because the question follows, why wouldn't we just do this for science as well? And I think, like math, content can get progressively more difficult in science, whereas with social studies, the content areas might have a bit more overlap and may be more transferable.
So then,
now,
to piggyback, go ahead, Mike.
I was a history major, and I can tell you, when I get past supply and demand, that's it on what I know on econ. They really are separate disciplines, and I think in the past, historically, we've lumped it all into one thing because we've always thought of it as, well, social studies. They really, particularly, geography certainly isn't. I mean, it's a very complex thing now. I don't know. I'm not going to opining. I'm just curious as to if we're giving up something in content knowledge.
So then to piggyback
broadly, huh? I'm sorry.
No, continue.
No, I did. I'm hitting mute.
I will add, if this is helpful, I'm looking at, as an example, the social studies praxis in this area, and it is 20% U.S. history, world history, government, 20% each, and then 15% geography, 15% econ, 10% behavioral sciences. So without question, it does split that up a bit. I think you also have to consider employment decisions and choice to teach or desire to actually teach a specific discipline. Because, Mike, I'm with you, and I took a bunch of econ courses in grad school. I couldn't teach it. But I think that there are some other factors in play here, and definitely worth discussing how it currently is a bit of a barrier for out-of-state folks.
Yeah, the only thing on the percentage of subjects covered under the assessment, that doesn't necessarily tell us if those subjects that the high school standards are adequately covered within that 20% of history. If it's a test of 100 questions total, y'all figure it out.
So, Michael, in what you just said, that answered my question, because I was really interested to know what exactly would the general social studies endorse creating it. What would that mean? Does that mean that we would change what's out there today? Could we eliminate econ, any aspects of what's already included today? Because I believe you said, but we don't have that. We don't have it, so we can establish what we want to have in that endorsement. Is that correct?
I think that's right. I think our thought here was to leave programs as is, and I think what that might do is allow candidates to have a focal area, right, a specific area which they're deeply trained, but also demonstrate their flexibility if they choose to, by the way, right, keeping in mind that this wouldn't be a must-have because we would still recommend retaining all of the discipline-specific endorsements. But if they chose to take the general social studies assessment, then they would qualify to be able to teach other courses. Okay. And it is your decision. And I think that there's probably merit to the conversation around, like we did with math, the 610 math, are there certain areas where you don't feel comfortable that general social studies endorsement should cover?
Michael, I wonder if this is also something where if a candidate early on indicates that they're interested in this, the EPP might also work with them to say, you're a history major, but you really want to go for this social studies endorsement. It would behoove you to take an elective in geography or an elective in econ or psych, something where they're expanding their training with whatever availability they have in their course taking.
I think that's an option. I think it then just becomes a question of whether it's required or encouraged. Yeah. If required, then that immediately makes it part of our program review process. We would have to determine which EPPs have that pathway to be able to make that recommendation. So worth considering that as well.
Yeah, I was just thinking, and I realize this would put us squarely in option 3, and I understand all of the constraints there. And I'm just totally going on anecdotal personal experience. That was what I had to seek in another state as I was getting the social studies endorsement. I was history major, but had to also take a smattering of courses across sociology and geography and the other areas of the social studies, which would be a much longer path to this endorsement. And as you said, people might not have that specialty, that focus area that they're particularly good at that they can bring to bear to their schools.
Right.
So Michael, did you say that the working group will take this up again? You all will discuss it and finalize your recommendation and prior to actually bringing it before the board for our vote. Did I interpret that correctly?
We certainly could. I think that the group was pretty clear on general approach, and that is that they supported option 2. I think this conversation does raise some additional questions. So I do want to make sure that when we do meet with EPWG next, I adequately cover those questions that you all are raising here.
Okay.
We're in quite a conundrum because obviously we would like to have the endorsements as specific as we can get them for the various categories, whether it's econ, history, sociology, or something like that. And yet, on the other hand, we have such a shortage of teachers across the state that we have to fill those positions, you know, and we want to fill them with the highest quality teachers that we have. So I don't know. I mean, in one way it says, well, we ought to be general, like, you know, option 3, but on another one, we want to be as specific as we can as option 2. So we've got a real challenge in front of us to get this right and provide the best quality teachers that we can. I don't know the answer to the question, but that's a real challenge that we have across Tennessee.
Agreed. Michael, what else on this subject? Anything else?
Not that I can think of. I think the one thing we certainly will bring back to the group, and maybe this conversation will help guide the decision around this as well, is what assessments are available. I think that if our intent is to solve, one challenge is to solve the out-of-state problem that I just articulated. It may be the case that all of our border states that have a general social studies endorsement are using the exact same assessment. So if we adopt another assessment, we're not solving that challenge, because then they would all have to go and take that assessment that we've adopted. So we'll dig deep into the assessments as well, in addition to having conversations about those topics that you all brought up today.
Well, thank you. We look forward to hearing from you again as we move forward and determine the best path forward. As Mr. Eby said, this critical shortage that we are experiencing, we certainly have a challenge before us, and looking for your guidance and research to help inform us in making the best possible decision for us. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Moving on to your next topic. Thank you.
So we wanted to provide an update on the 2 integrated early childhood endorsements. It's been nearly a year since the State Board adopted 2 new endorsements in early childhood that we envision will be truly integrated, general education and special education. We've had some delays in this area, and that's mostly as a result of a delay in the release of the CEC, or Council for Exceptional Children standards. They were just published this month, just a few weeks ago. So our first step in the process was to create the structure for the endorsements, which has taken place. Our next step is to identify the standards. So we have been thoroughly reviewing the new set of CEC standards and having conversations about those internally first, bringing back our working group that we had last fall to be able to discuss their interpretation of the standards and whether they're the most appropriate standards for these endorsements. That is likely going to happen next month. We then will convene ETS. So once we've identified the standards that we imagine will recommend to the board, we need to identify the assessments that are well aligned to those standards. So ETS has provided some options for different approaches to assessments for these 2 endorsements. Pearson was fairly limited in this area, so I think that ETS might be the route that we want to go here. But we do anticipate that we'll bring policy updates to you all at a minimum on the standards in February.
Michael, just clarification. This is minor. The stakeholder group, is that members from EPPs as well as LEAs? I know you mentioned them to provide their perspective, but that's the group? Members
yes,
from those
stakeholders? That's right.
Okay, very good. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is you and Amy Owen.
Amy, I'm happy to kick it off if you want me to give an update on where we are on this topic.
This one I think is you, and then the next one will be tag teaming.
Oh, okay, great. I don't have any content on a slide for this. I was intending for it to kind of be an open discussion, but first I wanted to just give an update on where we are in this space with our educator preparation providers. Way back when, about 5-6 years ago, we started conversations with the group about the importance of EPPs focusing on recruitment of underrepresented groups. And one group that we have had a significant focus on over the last few years are educators of color. And as we began that conversation, it fit naturally into conversations we were having around our annual report metrics. The report card also has metrics focused in this area. And we developed annual report metrics that really push providers to increase their performance, increase their percentage of candidates from underrepresented racial groups. So we have a metric that says you can meet the threshold if either 22% of your completer cohort is from an underrepresented racial group, or you see growth over a 3-year period. We're now 3 years into production of annual reports, nearing our 4th release. And we saw this as an opportune time to meet with the Educator Preparation Working Group again and revisit our metrics. In doing so, last month we had some really deep conversations about where this work can go. So I wanted to share a few of the things we discussed. We had someone from our educator effectiveness team, Ms. Joy Coates, focus a conversation around the needs for candidates of color. And we had a very rich conversation there where we discussed targeted efforts that EPPs can engage in to recruit candidates of color, cultural and system shifts that need to happen both within schools and districts and within educator preparation providers to not only recruit candidates of color, but support them through the program. Because, our metrics are simply focused on recruitment. But if candidates aren't recruited and supported in the program and have similar program completion rates, then we certainly haven't done our job. Dathri Chanduru from the research team looked at some of the trends. Now that we have 3-4 years of data, we looked at some of the trends in this area. So we're starting to dig into our historical data to really gauge whether there are some EPPs that are sticking out in this work. So we often hear that providers in East Tennessee face very specific challenges around recruiting candidates of color. What we'd like to know is, are there any EPPs in those regions that are bucking the trend? Are we seeing some true improvement in that area? One conversation that did come up is the ACT as a potential barrier for entry for candidates. Historically, when we look at the performance on the ACT, Black students over the last 3 years, about 19 to 20% of them are achieving the 21 ACT, which is the current benchmark for entry into a teacher prep program. That conversation then kind of naturally shifted to looking at the appeals procedure. So as you may recall, the state board rule allows for an appeals procedure for admission. So if a candidate does not meet the minimum entry requirements for admission, they may be admitted on appeal. The state board rule does not spell out the percentage of candidates that may be admitted on appeal, so it is fairly open. But one suggestion that we may bring back to the group is focusing our efforts around appeals procedures to say that if an EPP is planning to admit candidates on appeal, they must also or may also present very clear efforts to recruit and support candidates of color so that there is a pairing of supports and direct focus on candidates of color in their appeals procedure. So I'd be happy to just answer any questions, but I was hoping this could kind of be an open conversation about educator candidate diversity and preparation programs.
Michael, if universities were allowed, or EPPs were allowed to bring students in, back in my day it was called probation, come in on probation because you didn't score whatever on the ACT. Are they required if they are brought in to maintain certain GPA and other metrics?
From the ed prep standpoint, from what we oversee, no. I can imagine that exists among colleges and universities across the state, though. And Annie, feel free to jump in if you have any knowledge on any of this. But I do know that some EPPs have very clearly articulated appeals procedures where they will admit candidates who don't necessarily get the minimum ACT score, but then they'll lean on things like the practice core assessment as an alternative. I was looking for data on that to see if there are outcomes by race, and I struggled to find it, to be honest. But that is something we can look into to determine if is that a viable assessment to measure baseline knowledge.
Michael, I think you've covered several things that I had in the questions for you, but I often, think about the data side, and you did say that we would go back and revisit some of the metrics, so that was a recommendation that you received from Jan. Is it pronounced Cates? I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, Joy Coates.
Right. So that's one of the things that I'm certainly interested to know, because we know that when we put the diversity piece on the report card, there were still a lot of challenges for the ed prep providers to be able to attract candidates of color. And there are many myriad of reasons why that would be the case. But in some cases, I know that there have been universities that said that, we've hired people specifically to help us in that regard, and yet we still struggle. And there are times that students do not want to come to our area because the population of people of color is a very low percentage in the region, and it's difficult to get students who want to go to a region where they're not seeing people that look like them. And so I'm just curious about, the data related to all of that and the barriers that continue in that regard. That's one thing. And if we have a survey of EPPs, because I'll tell you, and I don't like doing that because it puts a burden on people, but we have to have this evidence to make informed decisions. So we do have a memo, if you will, and I believe, Michael, that you received it. I think it was forwarded to all of our board members, and I hope that each of the members of this committee at least have it. So we did receive some recommendations from the Deans for Impact, and they do speak about some of the challenges and looking for ways to, in a way, reimagine how do we bring in students of color from the various groups and knock down barriers and still not negate the quality. We still want to make sure that the quality is there. But there could be barriers that they're encountering that is not the same as, white people, if you will. I'm just going to put it out there. So what can we do? How can we begin to think about that? And I should say begin. I've been thinking about it. But how can we bring the powers to be that can affect the kind of change that will increase those that are in the pipeline to become educators, so that students do have access to teachers that look like them, and that we're also addressing the extreme shortage in teachers. So that's one thing. But I'm sorry, I said a lot of stuff there. But if you could talk about what you see that we may be able to do at the department level and in support from us as a committee.
Sure. Great points. And I think that Deans for Impact brief was super useful in pushing our thinking. There was an interesting quote that has stuck with me that came out of our last educator preparation working group, and that was "get your house in order." And I thought that was really interesting. And what that referred to was those providers that are struggling to recruit candidates of color, like districts and schools that are struggling with retaining teachers of color, there are some things that they need to consider too to be able to ensure that the space is conducive and supportive for those educators. And so when I look back at some of the things we discussed around culture and system shifts, While I think a lot of this was primarily focused on schools and districts and ensuring that these folks are retained, I think they equally apply to educator preparation providers. So creating culturally affirming school environments, preparation environments, affirming teachers' humanity and racial identity, empowering and investing in them, and building a school-wide family or program-wide family, and have a priority around it. So I think that we have seen some EPPs that have started to make these qualitative shifts, and I'll also add, and I don't think I said this before, that the CAPE standards push on this a bit as well. And so as we're on site and we're reviewing providers, there are things that are happening. There are providers that are better latching on to what's happening at the university level around this in this space, which is fantastic. You know, a lot of that is tough qualitative work, tough development work that you can't really change just by changing metrics on a report, or, you know. And so our intent is to, you know, with what little capacity we have, dig a bit deeper into what providers are doing right now, where they're finding pockets of success, and get that back out into the field. Either there is a presentation at TACTI by the Nashville Teacher Residency focused on this topic, and I think that we can learn from providers that have already seen success in recruiting, retaining, supporting folks on passing the praxis too, and make sure that we're spreading that across the state.
I think that's right, Michael. I just wanted to jump in and make one quick comment real quick, just based on a memory that I have of actually going with Michael when I was on his team on a comprehensive review site visit to an EPP that had made like some pretty incredible strides in recruiting diverse candidates. And one of the things that they talked about, and one of the other things I think that's important to consider, is just having the conversation about recruiting diverse candidates in the context of the institution as a whole. I think there are still some EPPs out there where you see their prospective teaching candidate pool doesn't even match the diversity on campus.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that this particular EPP mentioned as kind of an aha moment for them. And it kind of served as like a baby step, if you will, towards, I think, the ultimate goal, which is, I mean, we should probably have a more diverse teacher candidate pool perhaps than our institution, but at least trying to match the percentage of your institution that is diverse with your candidate pool, I think, is also an important way to like kind of consider this.
Jack, thank you for those comments. There's so much that we could say and that I could say here, and I never want to appear to be stepping on anybody's toes. I'm a big believer that unless you walk in someone else's shoes, you have no idea what they're truly up against. But I've had an opportunity to talk to individuals outside the education schools or colleges within a university, and there are wholesale changes that need to be made at a university level where diversity is given greater attention and more priority, and there are things that can happen at the highest level to instill it in every college within a university as well as with the students. And so what are we doing to do it to make it more attractive for students of colors? Because those are barriers to interest in even attending a particular campus or university. So thank you for those comments. There's a lot of work to be done, but Michael, you mentioned TACTI again, and I think about, is there a subset, a smaller group that should come together where we might have a seat at the table, and whether it's some of us or it's Amy and Sarah, along with ed prep people, providers, whether it's LEAs included or not, but to really get arms around this particular piece, because I've said this many times, the K-12 education space, they own a piece of this too, and what are they doing to create the environment in their campus and in their district with their students and with their teachers. So everybody owns this together. Mm-hmm. What do we do to bring a select group of people? When I say select, I don't know who that is, but whatever that number is that's appropriate, to come to some conclusions and recommendations that we could sell, that we could make sure that it would get the approval to move the deal in the right direction. And I'm saying what's reasonable, what's feasible from their perspective, what are we missing, what do we need to know, and so on and so forth. So I'll stop at that.
A couple things I'll note. Great point, first of all. And I think our educator preparation working group is very much an appropriate space for that type of conversation, and we've had it with them before. I think what we need to do is shift to a place where we're talking about tangible things that are within our locus of control, and those things that maybe just outside it, where we can be advocates, across other state agencies or at a different level, the provost and president level, maybe. And I think that we can kind of move from there. I will also say it is critically important in my mind, and I always have this in the back of my mind. When we first started having these conversations, it was around the time that a lot of research was coming out that was directly tying student achievement to teacher race. And so there's a lot of research out there directly making that connection. It's not just about students of color having teachers of color, but it's also the impact that white students benefit from having teachers of color as well. You can't really make that kind of a statement about all of our metrics even, right? You can't make direct connections between certain things and effectiveness, but in this space you absolutely can, which I think is where it just increases the importance of the conversation even more.
Definitely. Thank you.
Madam Chair, just one more thing I might ask Amy to jump in and add, because I do think it's just such a nuanced conversation, and as you said, it really is going to take all of us pushing from lots of different angles to make the needed movement on the candidate diversity issue in terms of really seeing our teacher candidates reflect better the students that they're serving. But one other sort of tool in our box is through legislation that requires, used to be an African-American sort of report and related policy. Now it's been revised slightly in statute to talk more broadly about diversity. But Amy, could you give us an update just for the purposes of the subcommittee, what's coming in November and where we are with that policy?
Absolutely. In 2019, the legislature passed a law that would require the state board to update what had been an old rule from 1984 about the employment, recruitment, and retention of African-American teachers specifically, to instead develop a policy about educator diversity. So I know Jack Powers has been working on this closely at the department along with several advocacy groups in this area. The legislation requires that LEAs establish a goal for the level of teacher diversity in their district, and that they develop a plan and have strategies to try to meet that goal. It also requires the department to publish some data annually about the percentage of teachers from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. So that will be coming to the board on first reading in November in alignment with that revised statute. I know Jack and I have talked about this. There were several times where different stakeholder groups pointed to the need to also work with ed prep providers to make sure that there are candidates in the pipeline who can become these diverse teachers, right? And the legislation did not specifically address ed preps. So the policy will be focused on LEA actions, but to my understanding, some of the recommended or suggested strategies will be about partnerships with EPPs and about working with high school students who have an interest in teaching to get them into that pipeline and support them through it. So I will say also, obviously, as we've talked about, we have the annual reports and the teacher prep report card where we've been pushing on this with the ed preps for several years now, and I think it got our community very bought in this area, and they're already working hard. So now it's coming at it from the angle of the LEA as well. Jack, did I miss anything you'd like to add?
No, I think you really hit on all the important pieces of it. I think, I just would emphasize how excited that I am to bring this on first reading to the board. We've had multiple different stakeholder groups, including TECA, TARA, weigh in on this topic. In addition to some department folks who themselves are former teachers of color. And I just think it's kind of the other important half of this pipeline we're talking about is how we can work with LEAs to kind of set achievable goals for themselves. And one of the things I'll mention, like I have the 3 actual bullet points of what the law calls out right in front of me, and it says, it mentions that the policy will contain strategies that LEAs can use in addition to the ones they may already for recruitment and retention of teachers or educators of color, the requirement that each LEA sets a goal for educator diversity. And I think the important and really thought-provoking part of this is it also says that the goal should take into consideration the diversity of the students that the LEA serves. And then, as Amy said, a plan to kind of monitor at the state level. And I think, when we've thought about monitoring, I think one of the things we've heard from the stakeholder groups is just the importance of transparency and just being able to kind of quickly address or assess what educator diversity looks like across the state. So we have a draft of that policy ready to go on first reading, and really excited, like I said, to kind of just share it. I know that Amy and I, in addition to some other folks, will be discussing it in the next week or so, and then certainly once we submit it to the board, and looking forward to the partnership, getting it ready to go on first reading in November.
Excellent. Thank you both for sharing that additional information with us. Anything else from either of you? Okay. Michael, thank you. I think you're up again this time with Amy on licensure reactivation.
Yes, ma'am. And this time I will do the first batting here.
Hey, great. I'm going to go grab my power cord because otherwise I won't be able to participate.
Great. Gotta keep you with us. We wanted to talk today about license reactivation. I know particularly Vice Chair Bob Eby raised this to my attention several months ago as a topic that he wanted to make sure got close attention from the board, and that we decided to see if there were any ways we could improve this process in the vein that we've talked about of having a shortage of educators in many subject areas and wanting to make sure that we are maintaining that balance of high but reasonable standards so that we can have as many folks available to enter or re-enter the profession as possible. So before we start talking about how a license can be reactivated, I wanted to talk about how does a license become inactive in the first place. There are two general distinctions between licenses. Professional licenses are for more experienced educators. They are valid for 6 years, and educators must complete certain requirements like earning professional development points to renew them. If those requirements are not met by the required deadline, the license goes inactive. So, for example, if I've been teaching for 6 years, or if I've been out of the classroom for 6 years, say I was home, I was in another profession, I was home with a child, whatever reason, I've been out of the classroom for more than 6 years, I have not submitted professional development points, my license would go inactive. Practitioner licenses are valid for 3 years. They're the first license that's issued. And educators have to meet certain requirements like completing their Ed Prep program if they were job embedded and did not complete the EPP before getting the license, obtaining 3 years of qualifying experience, and earning PDPs as well. Now that practitioner license may be reissued once, so if for some reason you were only able to teach or get qualifying experience for 2 of the 3 years, you could get it reissued and get your 3rd year. If at the end of the second issuance, the educator has not met all requirements, the license goes inactive. So those are the 2 ways we can end up with an inactive license. And Michael, stop me if I'm going astray anywhere. You deal with the nuts and bolts of this more than I do. In terms of how one then reactivates a license, for a professional license, which would be folks like classroom teachers, special education teachers, CTE teachers in academic areas. We'll get to occupational in just a second. To reactivate their license and the endorsements they hold, the educator needs to submit to the department evidence that they've completed their EPP, which they don't have to go back and do it again, but evidence that they completed it, and qualifying scores on all state board required assessments that are not more than 5 years old. This is for the endorsement areas that they want to reactivate. So if on my license I have history, geography, and economics, but I only want to reactivate history, I only need to take the history assessment. Correct so far, Michael? Great. For occupational teachers, these are certain CTE teachers. They may reactivate their license by doing both of the following. They have to show that they have either the applicable industry license or credentials. So if they're in an area maybe like an HVAC maintenance, that they have the appropriate certification to do that. Or if they're in an endorsement area where there's not some sort of license or credential in their career field, they have to have at least 5 years of relevant work experience within the last 10 years. And they would also have to submit qualifying scores that are not more than 5 years old on any required licensure assessments. There's a very similar theme here for school services personnel, which would include folks like a speech-language pathologist or a school counselor. They would have to have those assessment scores that are not more than 5 years old. And if they're in areas that have a state licensing board, they would need to submit evidence of maintaining a current and valid license in that area. So if I am a certified counselor or a psychologist and I have a license from another board or from a board in another state, I would need to show that that's valid. There's two that are not common that I listed. The license for post-secondary educators deals with somebody who's been teaching at the college level, who can obtain a license to teach in grades 9 through 12. And instructional leader licenses are for aspiring assistant principals only. So those are not particularly common, but I listed them here as other types that may require reactivation. Sorry for flipping the slides a little bit. Really, this is just an overview of how a license goes inactive and what one might do to reactivate it. I'll say before we open discussion, we've talked philosophically before about this need to have assessments that are not more than 5 years old. And really the logic here is that the assessments themselves can change over time, they can be updated, but more importantly, best practices in a content area or how to approach it or how to teach it might also change over time. So we want to make sure that somebody has recent and relevant knowledge and that they've indicated that knowledge within the last 5 years so that they're ready to teach. We can be assured that they will have the content knowledge they need for districts. With that, I'm happy to open it up to questions or to comments or scenarios that our board members have heard that they would like to bring up as concerns. Michael, do you want to jump in real quick before we open it up?
Well, I was going to ask if this would be helpful now or at some point, but I do have Eric Olmstead on the call, who's our Director of Licensure and Operations, and she spent a little time over the last couple of days looking at reactivation requirements in nearby states. So
yes, that'd be great.
I'm happy, they're very brief. I'm happy to go through that right now if that would be useful.
That'd be great, thank you.
So in Georgia, individuals either have, and this is all for reactivation, so somebody lets their license expire, these are the requirements. In Georgia, they either have to take the content assessment or complete one of the various PD requirements, so 100 hours in some cases, 10 professional learning units or CEUs or 6 college credits. And then there is some nuance there with years of experience. It gets a little complicated. North Carolina, one conversation I know that the board has probably come up against, and I know we have as well, is could somebody just use an active out-of-state license to reactivate their Tennessee license? And so one of the things we looked at when we looked across other states is whether that's a pathway in those states. So Georgia, no. North Carolina also does not accept out-of-state certifications. They require 8 CEUs or 80 clock hours of professional development with prescribed credits in specific content areas based on the endorsement. Mississippi allows out-of-state licenses or 6 college credits for reinstatement. Alabama requires praxis exams and college credit. Florida requires 6 hours of college coursework and assessments to reactivate. So very few states allow for use of an out-of-state credential. Most states that we looked at are fairly similar to us with some exceptions for requirements around PD or college courses in addition to the assessment.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Eric, for looking into those. That's really helpful to know whether our requirements are in line with expectations in other states to make sure that we're not out of whack one direction or another.
Maybe I can speak now since I'm sort of the one that brought this issue up. And let me give you a couple of examples of situations that I'm aware of. And again, what brings me to this is the shortage that we have on teachers. We want to maintain the quality aspect of the teachers, but are there situations where we could have people that could have a license or had a license and who could teach in our schools, but we're preventing from that because of some rule or something that we have. This individual is a speech and language pathologist working in the state of Tennessee for many years. When she started, she worked in multiple nursing homes, and she got her Tennessee Board of Health issues. And then first, she has a master's degree in communication disorders, and she completed her clinical hours in the Oak Ridge School District. And so she got school education endorsement and also had to pass the practice exam to graduate. So she qualifies under those rules. And so then she got a job in Oak Ridge Schools because of maternity leave. And with her license, she had a job, and that was in 2011. And then when that temporary job went away, she went back to teaching in the nursing school. And at her 5-year time period, she wanted to re-up her teacher license. And because she wasn't working in a school at the time, she was not allowed to renew her license. And so her license expired. And then she went back and wanted to get back into school systems. And because her license had expired, even though she wanted to renew it, but because she wasn't in the school system at the time, and she was taking, every year she did her 10 PEU credits, et cetera, she wasn't able to renew it. She wasn't able to get a job as a teacher. Well, the state of Tennessee has a need through their TennCare insurance to use in their school systems, these speech and language pathologists. And so she's hired in, working in Roane County schools right now, doing exactly what she would be doing if she had a license, being paid through by the TennCare and the insurance, but she can't get a license. And so I asked her, she made a comment. She said, well, I think this is a situation that's occurring quite a bit across the state that, we can't get licensed even though we were previously licensed. And I said, well, can you give me more examples? And so she said the small company she works in, she believes that there's 7 other speech and language pathologists that no longer have the license. And she knows that there's other companies within the immediate area, I guess the SLP at Little Tennessee Valley Speech Therapy, another friend of hers is in the same category, and Sidekick is another company in the Knoxville areas. And she personally knows of 10 speech and language pathologists that have taken contract work because they can't get their education license. She was recently contacted by providing teletherapy for students in Tennessee, but she couldn't pursue the job because she didn't have a license. But she is doing teletherapy 2 days a week for a company elsewhere, and she's actually applying and going to get a California license so that she can do teletherapy in the state of California from Tennessee. So we're transporting somebody who could be valuable to us here in Tennessee, is going to actually, through virtual learning, going to be virtual teaching, going to be teaching out in California, but she can't teach in Tennessee. So she said that, and she has a national license and so her request is that those that hold the national license be allowed to be, Tennessee, be more competitive and not lose these students. And so this is I guess it's, and maybe it's I don't think it's a one-off. I think it's a situation that, here we have people who are taking their 10 hours of PDHs every year, have been doing this for several years, so they meet that requirement. She passed the practice exam. If she would have been teaching, if she had been in the school system when she was going to renew her license, she would just renewed her license and that would have been it. But because she was not in the school system, she couldn't renew her license. But now she's teaching through the state doing exactly the same thing. So something here seems amiss that, we ought to be able to fix and open up the opportunity for other teachers to help meet this shortage of teachers that we have, whether it's in speech and language pathology or something else.
Thank you, Bob, for sharing that, and for you're always so great at advocating for your constituents' concerns in your area. And oftentimes, what starts as one person's concern, when you really start digging, turns out to be a situation that applies to more people than one might have thought. So, Michael, do you want to comment on some of the specifics of this? I know you and I have been batting around thoughts about folks who hold a license from another agency or an out-of-state or national one, so we can come to that when you're ready.
Yeah, I am. I think that, you know, we've had conversations about folks, Bob, that have reached out with very similar circumstances. And, you know, our response is you have to take and pass the required content assessment for your area. It has to be no more than 5 years old. So it sounds like that individual, you know, if they took the assessment back in 2011 or whatever, their practice would obviously be too old. There are pathways, obviously, for folks to get licenses in Tennessee through those professional licenses, the national or the state issued licenses from other agencies. It feels logical to me to look at that as an option. I think another unique sort of thing in the situation you described, as you noted a couple times, is this person is actually functioning in that role currently. So it's a little different than the person who is teaching for however many years, leaves the system entirely, and the test they took to get licensed was 3 tests ago, 3 iterations of the standards ago, then, you know, those are 2 very different situations. I think it's a balance, right? We have to consider how comfortable do we feel about the evidence that we have about the individual person as far as the relevancy of their knowledge and maybe their practice versus the flexibility needed to be able to address the shortages. So I think school services personnel is a bit of a separate conversation from my perspective, where looking at those national and state credentials that are issued that they have to maintain, by the way, right? They have to do plenty of things to maintain those credentials. That might be a little different than looking at folks who get their license in Tennessee to teach, but never come to Tennessee, maybe teach in Florida, maintain a license there, or another state where it's really, really easy to maintain a license and expect that they can just keep their Tennessee license in perpetuity.
I know this person actually reached out to the department a few times and actually never got a response from the department. So I think that she was a little frustrated by that. And like I say, it's not that she hasn't been teaching, so she's not, I mean, she's very relevant in what she's doing. And so, you know, I don't know what you do in a case like that.
Well, please have her email me, hopefully not again, meaning that I was the one that did not respond, but it is entirely possible, and I apologize if there was a delay, or actually not a delay, just a non-response there.
I will do that, and that's good for her. But again, it opens up, like you say, as Amy was saying, we find that there's this situation broader, and maybe there's an opportunity that we have to help our teacher shortage issue with quality people, whether it be in, you know, I mean, what she says is there's a real shortage, and the shortage is getting greater and greater because it's virtual learning and the needs for speech and language pathologists. So, you know, here's an opportunity there, but what else is out there?
Yeah, I'll also say, full transparency, speech language pathologist pathways to licensure have perpetually confused me, even though I've been in this role for a long time. We are having ongoing conversations with some folks in our department who are kind of the experts in that role to make sure that, like just in our internal processes, we aren't adding barriers or burdens to licensure there. So we have already made some improvements there that we'll be happy to share once we can get them on paper and I can better articulate them to you all. But there has been some work on that front too. But I think it's, you know, a really good point that you're making.
Thank you.
I do not have any examples as Bob has described, but I am confident, as you indicated, that there are many more cases that are similar in nature. So I do look forward to hearing the results of the ongoing conversations that you are having in the department, and hopeful that a solution will be found, because when you just listen to this particular case, it almost seems illogical, because she is in fact, I believe you said this, Bob, that she's in fact teaching is it Roane County?
Roane County Schools, right.
Through
TennCare.
Through TennCare. So another entity within the state is utilizing her. And so there's this backdoor access and entry into. And so there seems to me that there would be another solution that would make sense and be logical, and especially with the fact that she has experience and she continues to work in that arena. And I'm sure there are lots of other cases of that nature. So I welcome more work to be done in that area, to Bob's point, and certainly because of the teacher shortage, it often comes back to that while still maintaining quality educators in the system. So I think we all have that at the forefront of our minds. So thank you for that.
In terms of a concrete next step, it sounds like from the example today, but also just because it's something that I'll join with Michael. I know that these are very complex standards for these different professions. It's not the same as being a classroom teacher in terms of your pathway to getting a license and whatever kind of additional license you need from your sort of the other agencies that might be involved here. Sounds like just re-examining and making sure that we're very clear on literally how does somebody who has one of these school service personnel license types obtain and maintain, and if necessary, reactivate their license, that we can be really sure on not just what's in rule and policy, but as Michael said, what are the things that licensure specialists are looking for in an application? What are the things that are commonly deficient? And we can identify what those are for the different types of whether it's a school psychologist or a speech path or a school counselor, obtaining clarity in those areas so we can see if there's anything that's redundant or looked for that shouldn't be or something like that, and then bring that back to you all as we contemplate whether this is a rule and policy change or whether it's something procedural.
Amy, I think that makes sense. The only other thing I would say is we should look at other license types that we have adjusted over recent months and or years in some cases in terms of like the professional license and sometimes where we allow that versus the school-based license. I know we have a couple examples that we could look to in terms of where we've made some adjustments for similar reasons, but that sounds like a good next step.
Amy, would it at all be helpful to, so on that under school services personnel right there, that B, submit evidence of current valid, so each school services personnel area has a different corresponding state or national certification, and those certifications have their own requirements. Mm-hmm. Would it be helpful to know, or for us to reach out to our special POPs team to be able to kind of survey what those requirements are so you all are knowledgeable about what they're having to do to maintain their national or state credential outside of education?
I think that would be very helpful, and also how often those things are typically revised. I was reading something else recently about, I think, an upcoming revision of the NASP standards for school psychologists, and it got me thinking about how often would these things be revisited, because one of the reasons we have those assessments that are no more than 5 years old is we want to make sure they're modern and relevant, and so if another agency or licensing board is frankly doing that work for us of making sure things are modern and relevant, that could really help this discussion.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for bringing this up. Bob, in particular, do you feel solid about that as a direction moving forward?
No, I'm glad to see the thing moving forward, and it was a good, excellent discussion. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Very good. So that does conclude our discussion of that particular item, and thank you so much for the great work you all did, both of you, on this particular item. I know more to come. I know we have a lot of next steps for a number of things that we have discussed today. But before I do that and before we adjourn, Dr. Morrison, do you have comments that you want to make at this juncture before we adjourn? Because we do have several items that we will look to for future discussion in this particular meeting, as well as items you mentioned that you'll bring before the board in February, and I believe there was one item for November.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Nothing actually that I think we'll have another full agenda next time this group comes together, so I won't get into too many other things that I think would be appropriate for those future meetings, but I do look forward to follow-up from our staff and our partners at the department with this subcommittee in terms of some of the next steps that we've identified today. It was a really rich series of conversations across some really important topics, again, from the report card to educator diversity to some of these licensure questions. So as always, I know we're all walking away with a number of thoughts and some open-ended questions, and maybe Amy and Michael, we can make sure we sort of follow up with some of the points and the next steps that were identified today, and look forward to continuing to work with this group on those issues and some others that we'll want to bring to you at a future meeting.
Thank you for that, Dr. Morrison. A great discussion, a lot of important topics discussed today. Thanks to everyone again for your great work and your due diligence. I know we continue to move forward and make accomplishments, and we're looking forward to more to make our opportunity to attract more teachers the best approach that we can have going forward. So thank you all so much. Any other closing comments from anybody else? Then we stand adjourned. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you.